We're going to shift to look at a branded ingredient that is New Zealand's natural solution for metabolic support. Please welcome Phillipa Thmpson. She is product champion at Anagenics with a research focus on New Zealand sourced ingredients, exploring health benefits and applications for functional foods and dietary supplements. As always, you can post your questions and we'll get to those at the end.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm really excited to present to you Phillipa, our ingredient here at Anagenics that is New Zealand's natural solution for metabolic support. My name is Phillipa Thmpson, as I've been so kindly introduced, and I am one of the product champions here at Anagenics for Phillipa. So what is Phillipa? Phillipa is a scientifically supported and patented fruit ingredient that has been shown to reduce blood glucose, reduce cholesterol and triglycerides, prevent weight gain, and reduce joint pain. It's made from a fruit that we have here in New Zealand called a feijoa. That's those pretty images of those fruit up on the screen there. And a feijoa is a really common fruit here in New Zealand, originally native to Uruguay and other parts of South America. It is a green fruit that has a flavor kind of similar to a pineapple guava if you put them together, but it's really yummy and eaten quite widely here in New Zealand. So how do we make this powder? Just to sort of, I guess, give the first little idea, is we make it through a proprietary manufacturing process. We use the whole fruit of the feijoa, and then through our expertise in sort of optimized freeze drying processes, we freeze dry this powder into a whole fruit powder. But our IP sort of comes from our technology during this freeze drying process. We're using precision freeze drying, reduced drying times, and ultra low temperatures. We're actually able to optimize the bioactives that we find present in this, leading to greater fiber retention and an increase in the bioavailability of the whole sum of these bioactives that we have in this fruit. So Phillipa has been over a decade in the making, starting back in 2011 with a research organization here in New Zealand called Callaghan Innovation. They were able to develop a feijoa extract that led to a feijoa patent that was able to show improvement in symptoms for those with type 2 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. From there was a clinical study where we looked at hyperglycemia in patients with type 2 diabetes, and we proceeded down a development pathway where we figured out the things like mechanism of action, identification of the bioactives, and in the development of a powder, which led to our finished product here for sort of glucose management and diabetes management. From there, most recently, we've completed 2 different human clinical studies here, one in collaboration with the University of Auckland, where we looked at participants with pre-diabetic symptoms or high fasting plasma glucose to see if Phillipa can help ameliorate some of these metabolic symptoms. So what is actually in Phillipa that makes it work? We've got 3 different bioactives that we try to focus on. Our first one is our anti-inflammatory polyphenols. Then we have something called abscisic acid, and we have dietary fiber. So all 3 of these, and the reason why we get so excited about them, actually stimulate GLP-1. Now, GLP-1 is a term that I'm sure we've all heard a lot of recently, and is sort of the subject of, or the target, I guess, for most of these semaglutide or weight loss drugs that we see. So we have 3 different pathways that we're able to stimulate GLP-1. Abscisic acid is a compound that you've probably not heard of, but it is a universal signaling hormone found in most plants. But specifically, New Zealand feijoas actually have twice as much abscisic acid as the next recorded fruit, which is, say, an avocado or a fig. And so abscisic acid is associated with the separation of the fruit from the stem. Feijoas, if you didn't know, grow on trees. And so when they drop, they're at their ultimate peak ripeness, which also means their ultimate peak abscisic acid. And why do we care about abscisic acid? It's because it is a direct GLP-1 secretor, amongst other things. There's over 84 studies at the moment looking at the effects of abscisic acid, and what they have been able to find is that abscisic acid directly leads to about a 41% increase in GLP-1 secretion. It's able to work along 4 different pathways in both your pancreas, your brain, adipose cells, and your muscle cells by binding to specific receptors we have called lensil-2 as well as GLUT4 receptors to help cause a variety of changes from that GLP-1 secretion up to glucose absorption, increase in thermogenesis, so using more of that fat, and also even in your brain to reduce neuropathic pain. So the other compounds that we have are, we have our dietary fiber. So we have a specific kind of dietary fiber called xyloglucans, which are able to support your microbiome, and then and provide food for it. And your microbiome then produces something called short-chain fatty acids, which also leads to an increase in GLP-1, increased satiety, and that decrease in fat synthesis. We also have a full suite of polyphenols. We've had that characterized, and we have approximately 32 different polyphenols present in Phillips. And the key ones that we like to think about are the allagitannins, which in your microbiome are modulated into urolithins, which are insulin secretagogues, as well as something called flavins, which is galactitins, epicatechins. These words might sound familiar if you're really into green tea. It's a very similar selection of polyphenols that we find there. And they are all converted into something called hippuric acid, which is very anti-inflammatory. And yeah, so as you can see here, Pheolix has a whole range of phenolic compounds, different families. It's actually got 41% fiber, so it's an incredibly high in fiber, and it's got a 1.8% nutrient density. The whole fruit powder, and the reason why we like to talk about this, is important because it's not just an extract. It contains these sugars and these fibers, which are incredibly important, not only for intestinal absorption, but also for digestion, protection in your stomach, so that these bioactives can get to where they need to go. And it's also got a low GI for, say, people who are, on trying to lose weight and those sorts of things. And another exciting thing about our whole food powder is that it contains something called a non-extractable polyphenol. So traditionally and historically, when we're trying to figure out what polyphenols we might have present, we do an extraction in order to measure them. But we have recently found out that by having this whole fruit matrix and the inclusion of that fiber as opposed to just an extract, there's actually a whole series of non-extractable polyphenols that are still getting bound up in the fiber and becoming available in your intestine and available for use. In the case of Pheolix, we found that 77%, there was 77% more non-extractable polyphenols present than just the ones that we had traditionally measured. So it's just giving you this really comprehensive support for this whole fruit powder. So how does Pheolix work? Just very briefly, that abscisic acid and those xyloglucans, as well as the polyphenols, travel to either your pancreas or your intestinal L cells, where they both secrete GLP-1, which then leads to an increase in that insulin secretion. And therefore, when you're eating things like carbohydrates, will then lower your blood glucose due to that increased insulin. So that's how we can reduce insulin resistance. We can also increase your satiety by, again, that GLP-1 being secreted, going to stomach receptors in your stomach, which actually slows your gastric emptying, leaving you to feel fuller for longer and wanting to eat less. And then lastly, we're also able to increase satiety by that GLP-1 and then another compound in your intestinal L cells called PYY, crossing your blood-brain barrier. That's that long word on the screen there that says hematoencephalic barrier, which crosses into your brain and then binds to receptors there, which lead to a signaling effect from your brain telling you you're full. So we've just got all of these different ways that what Pheolix is able to help support, increase in satiety, decrease in insulin resistance, and provide that full metabolic support. So something we like to think about is for aging and unhealthy aging specifically, occurs usually when you have an unhealthy metabolism. So over time, we get things like chronic low-grade inflammation, changes in your gut composition, which lead to things like oxidative stress. And this then leads into inflammaging, which can lead to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and dementia. But Pheolix is able to provide support across this full range. So it's an anti-inflammatory, it's a prebiotic, it's an antioxidant, it provides mitochondrial support, which can just lead to a reduction in all of these symptoms, specifically for type 2 diabetes, dementia, and obesity. So we did it very briefly. We did an initial study in mice where we looked at different dosages of Pheolix from 2,300 milligrams all the way down to 100. And we gave these mice a high-fat diet, and we then tested them against controls for something like metformin, which is a diabetes drug, as well as a non-diabetic control. And what we found over the course of 6 months is that even at 300 milligrams dosage of Pheolix, we had significant reductions in both fasting blood glucose, cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and triglycerides that was actually equivalent in some cases to the metformin, which is, again, a pharmaceutical drug that we feed, that we give to people who are diabetics. And so even here, and even at that 2,300 milligram dosage, we had even more amazing results. And so when we looked at the body weight changes over the 6-month period, when we compared it to the metformin control, the high-fat diet, and the non-diabetic, we found that Phillips at 2,300 milligrams was actually able to prevent weight gain and prevent liver damage that was akin to a metformin. So all of those fantastic results led us to think, okay, we need to test this in people. And that's why I'm here today, to tell you about the new human clinical that we've recently just finished. So this was completed at the University of Auckland, which is one of our primary universities here in New Zealand. We had 97 participants, and this took place over the course of a 6-month period in collaboration with a unit called the High Value Nutrition Unit. And so the way the study was designed is for the first 2 months, the participants, or the study participants, were given a low energy diet for 2 months that was designed to induce weight loss. So they were consuming roughly 800 calories a day. To put that into perspective, we, on average, as a person, consume 2,000 calories a day. So there was a really significant reduction in calories here. And then the participants were either given placebo or Felix at an 1150 milligram dosage. And then after that 2 months of that low energy diet, the participants were allowed to switch on to a 4-month weight diet, or a weight maintenance diet. And the purpose here wasn't to see could Felix help these participants lose weight, but more could they help them in their rebound afterwards to prevent them from putting on further weight. One of the key reasons for this is actually a much more valid way to measure weight loss or weight gain, I suppose, and is a truer expression scientifically. We were able also to measure things like HbA1c, body weight, fasting plasma glucose. So for the 39 study, the first symptom that we looked at was a reduction in fasting plasma glucose. And so I know this graph looks a little bit confusing, but pretty much what we're looking at here is a comparison between Felix and placebo at baseline and after 2 months where they had that low energy diet. So we were expecting a really significant reduction here. But what's important is that, as you can see in placebo, after that 2 months, when they went back to eating whatever they liked, they pretty much returned to baseline for their fasting plasma glucose. Whereas Felix was able to help them keep that glucose off and remove and not have it return to baseline. So there was a statistical significant difference here, and we actually saw 185% improvement in their fasting plasma glucose compared to the placebo for the Felix group. If you look over here, they had roughly a 6% change from the baseline, where the placebo only had 2%. And I know those numbers seem really small, but when we're talking about something like fasting plasma glucose, this is an incredibly significant difference. Usually, as for someone to not be diabetic, it's something pretty much under 6. So there's just not usually a lot of change here in these numbers. So this was really amazing that Felix was able to significantly reduce that fasting plasma glucose. And so why do we care about fasting plasma glucose? Just briefly. So a lower SPS is associated with an improved regulation of your blood sugar. So in other words, your body responds better to insulin when given it, and it allows that glucose to be able to be used more efficiently. So the lower your fasting plasma glucose, the better you are at your insulin regulation. And an improved fasting plasma glucose is linked to things like a reduced risk of heart disease, strokes, and other metabolic conditions. It's kind of like our baseline for how are you doing metabolically. So to see that 185% improvement compared to placebo was just amazing. Our next thing that we found was that we had a very statistical significant reduction in systolic blood pressure. So again, here, as you're looking at this graph, we have this placebo where over the course of the 2 months went down, but then we actually saw an increase in their blood pressure after the 4-month period, where Felix really helped it decrease and then stayed decreased. We had, so to put into perspective, there's a 5% pharmaceutical level reduction in systolic blood pressure is considered to be pharmaceutically sound. Things like statins have roughly a 5 to 10%, and Felix here was able to have that 5% reduction. When we looked at it in this way, what we could see is that within that first 2 months, Felix actually reduced your systolic blood pressure by 9 units, which is insane. And even after the dietary restrictions were eased and after that further 4 months, we had a 7-unit reduction in systolic blood pressure, where the placebo only had 3. So we say that with every 5 milligrams of mercury reduction in your systolic blood pressure, the risk of a major cardiovascular event actually drops by about 10%. So for every 10 milligrams, that risk of cardiovascular event is reduced by about 20%. And your all-cause mortality actually drops by about 13%. So this is a really significant improvement for reduction in major cardiovascular events. Same thing with diastolic blood pressure. So systolic is the one on top, the diastolic is the one on the bottom, and the diastolic is the one that's usually much harder to change. And same thing here, we had a statistical significant reduction in diastolic blood pressure compared to the placebo. Here we had, so as you can see here, after the intervention effect, we had about 75% versus 75 milligrams of mercury versus an 80 for the placebo. And so that was a roughly 8 to 10% reduction in these cardiovascular events. Our next thing that we looked at was in body weight. And what we could see is that for median body weight, Phillipa was able to remain relatively stable after that first 2 months, where the placebo group saw a significant increase and a much greater rebound effect. So what we can see here is about after both 2 months, both groups lost roughly 10 kilos of weight. But then Phillipa here, despite the participants being able to eat whatever they want, was able to maintain a much better rebound compared to the placebo, which, as you can see here, was on a trend back to baseline given time. So we were able to see that Phillipa was able to help reduce body weight. And then same thing with our lipid profiles. Phillipa versus placebo in cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL cholesterol was able to have a better rebound effect compared to placebo. And things such as visceral adipose tissue mass, which is the fat that wraps around your internal organs, and that's actually the fat that we're really mostly concerned about. Not so much the belly fat, even though I'm sure we all have a complaint about that one. This one's the fat that we actually worry about from a scientific standpoint. And we can see here that the placebo from that month 2 to month 6 was on a much greater trend upwards to returning to this, where Phillipa was able to help keep it off. So even though both groups lost a significant amount of visceral adipose tissue, the Phillipa group did have less of a rebound. So our key takeaways from this study, which we're really happy with, is that there was a significant effect in both fasting plasma glucose and blood pressure, and we could expect up to a 20% reduction in heart attacks and strokes from that. And then in the rebound effect, we saw better maintenance for weight loss, as well as cholesterol, triglyceride, and LDL cholesterols. And this leads us to believe that Phillipa can provide that comprehensive metabolic support, helping to significantly reduce these fasting blood glucose and blood pressures. We have also completed a safety study recently, because we've had a few people say, oh, but so what about diabetics? Is this safe for them? You know, if we're lowering your plasma glucose this much. And so this was participants with 30 participants who were diabetic, who consumed our high dose of Phillipa every day for 3 months. And this was just to demonstrate safety, as that was the main outcome, was, you know, were there any adverse effects? And we were able to find that, and so there were no adverse effects reported, which was really great. But we also got out of the study that there was a reduction in HbA1c by 0.3 units. To put that into perspective, something like metformin, we'd expect to reduce your HbA1c by about 0.5 units. So considering that this isn't a pharmaceutical medication, but instead just a fruit powder, we're absolutely pleased with this. And same thing that we were able to find that there was a 17% reduction in triglycerides, which again goes back to that lowering your risk for heart disease. So we also, just very briefly to touch on, are going to be doing a new study, which is ongoing at the moment, which is with our lower dosage of 300 milligrams. And we're specifically measuring GLP-1 secretion, as well as blood glucose, ghrelin, and satiety. We're expecting this to be completed probably at the end of the year. And now, very briefly, we did also recently do a very interesting consumer study with continuous glucose monitoring, or a CGM. I don't know if anyone's seen diabetics. They usually wear them. They go on the back of your arm, and they're a little white thing, and they give you real-time measurements for your blood glucose. So we had 16 volunteers agree to eat the same breakfast, which is 44 grams of carbohydrates. There was a yogurt and a honey and some juice, and then they had that breakfast every single day with different dosages of Phillipa. And the CGM was able to in real time measure everyone's blood glucose levels. And so what we found from this, so just a little bit about blood glucose curves, I guess, is that when you eat food, your blood glucose goes up, and then it should go down, and you ideally want that to be as smooth and rolly as you want. When you eat things like Coke or really sugary things, your blood sugar goes up like this, it spikes, and then it crashes immediately. And that is not good for your insulin resistance, and it's not good for your metabolic health. And so what we were hoping to see here is that Phillipa should hopefully help to modulate that and make it a bit smoother. And that's what we can see here in this graph. And I know it looks a little bit confusing, but so this is green line here is Phillipa, is the breakfast with no Phillipa. And as you can see here, we have quite a sharp spike up and then it goes down. And then this line here is where what their fasting was. And so as you can see here, after that very sugary breakfast, they actually plunged below their fasting level, which leads to things like hunger, crankiness, tiredness, so that you've got low blood sugar. And so that's what we could do. That's what we could see here with the Felix. And then as you can see here, at these increasing dosages, what we were able to see is a significant reduction in that peak, and instead of going below fasting, they're having a much smoother, I guess, descent back out. So even at, say, this 300 milligrams for Felix, which, as you can see here, was able to stay above fasting and provide more support. When you look over here, when we look at the reductions in that blood sugar spike, we can see at the 300 milligram dosage, we actually had a 22% reduction in blood sugar spike compared to just the compared to baseline. And same thing for sustained blood glucose for a percent improvement from that 45 minutes over here to that 2-hour time period. We found that even at 300, which was our lowest dosage, we had a 17% improvement in that sustained blood glucose levels. And so having sustained blood glucose is really important because that's your satiety that helps you feel fuller for longer and less hungry. And that blood sugar spike reduction is important because it helps to prevent that insulin resistance that you can have, because that's what places stress on your cells. And so, yeah, here you can see, and I guess a bit clearer, without Felix, and then at your 300, and then even at your 1150 over here, just a much better improvement in sustained energy levels and blood glucose levels. So if you're like me and you're a bit of a nerd, you're probably really fascinated at the different metabolisms that different ethnic groups have, because there's a clear demonstrated difference between these different groups. So as you can see here, the European participant had a bit of a spike and then had quite a significant crash, where the participant who was for Latin American descent had a really significant spike, but not so much, only a little bit of a crash. But we can see in both groups that the 300 and the 1150 definitely did a really good job of smoothing out their blood sugar curves, and same thing here. So it is just interesting to see that it does work for different ethnic groups. And then very, very last, briefly, so we have for menopause and hormonal support, we did another consumer study where we looked at Felix for women who were experiencing perimenopause. There's been a lot of really interesting research showing that the estrogen, which is your microbiome that produces estrogen, is able to be affected by things like GLP-1 and other metabolic support. So we thought that both our abscisic acid as well as our dietary fiber should be really good at modulating this estrogen. And so we had 21 women enroll who were experiencing perimenopausal or menopausal symptoms, and we gave them 700 milligrams of Felix a day for 8 weeks. And what did we find? Wow, we found that we had up to a 68% improvement in symptoms for things like depressive mood, for restlessness. We had a really significant improvement in things like sleep problems or anxiety, a lot of the symptoms that we might associate with a change in your hormones and how you're doing mentally. So this just made us really excited for Felix could be the next treatment for menopause. And if that's something you're interested in, we have a lot more information about it, and we are currently looking into a clinical for this. So to sort of, I guess, wrap up the concept of Felix, we have a couple of different dosages, but primarily we focus on both our 300 and our 1150, which is what our clinical was based on, for lowering blood glucose, LDL cholesterol. When we talk about sort of just some of the things that Felix is really good for, what makes us special is that because we're a whole fruit powder, it tastes absolutely amazing. Felix is so yum. If you've never tried a Feijoa, I really highly recommend you try one, or maybe just go try a guava if you're in the States. But so it's a light green sort of brownie color. It is, so it's really good for formulating if you're having things like tablets or sachets or gummies or lollies, anything like that. It's also incredibly stable. It's got a 36-month shelf life because it is a freeze-dried fruit powder. It's got a good particle size distribution if you're a formulator for those sorts of, whether or not you put it into a tablet or a pill. We do find that, the sweetness, it's got quite a flaw. It's not very bitter. It is standardized, I should also note, to that 4 milligrams of abscisic acid, and it's quite stable in pH, low pHs. Same thing here. It's stable at higher temperatures for processing. Up on your right, there's just an example of sort of one of our newer recent products, which is a 28 days metabolic balance. It is also suitable for things such as yogurts and, and those sorts of, I guess, lower pHs that we found. And yeah, you can, it's stable. Abscisic acid is an incredibly stable bioactive. So it's actually stable for up to 116 for 20 minutes. Some of the claims that we do make is that it provides metabolic support, supports joint health, supports healthy blood glucose and triglycerides, and supports hormonal balance. And we do have a patent, especially in America, which is for the treatment of type 2 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. And even one of our claims that we have is for a method for preventing or reducing obesity. And so these patents we hold up in the US, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. And that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time today to listen to me. I hope I wasn't too quick or the accent wasn't a bit confusing, but please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about Felix. It is an amazing ingredient and we are absolutely in love with it. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, excellent. That's a great session to take us home today. I love the enthusiasm about the science, learned so much. Samantha's joining us here to field any questions as well. So if you have a question, please post it into the Q&A panel. And we have one final question for our audience today. Our last poll of the day is, which attributes are most important when evaluating ingredients for metabolic health or GLP-1 support? You can pick up to 2 of these: clinical substantiation, mechanisms of action, dose, consumer familiarity, clean label, or cost. So let us know what you're looking for the most when you're thinking about that metabolic health category. We'll give just another couple seconds for that so you guys can weigh in. And then let's take a look. Let's see where we stand on this one. All right, we have the data, human data, far and away, 79% there. Mechanism of action, specifically targeting GLP-1, 42% said that, followed by cost at 21%, then dose and consumer awareness on it. So excellent insights. Thank you for sharing that. And now a couple questions. We were asked about, is it safe to take with statin or metformin?
Good morning, Maggie. I guess I'll answer that. Hi, Samantha. So yeah, that's a great question. We've actually just recently completed a safety study on diabetics who were consuming metformin. We had a population size of 16 participants, and I'm really pleased to say that we had no adverse effects reported over the course of the 6-month safety study, and they were consuming our highest dose of Felix, which I didn't even really mention, which is 300 milligrams. So yeah, it's because it sort of enhances your body's natural, I guess, insulin system that it has, that you're not ever really at risk of sort of going too far in the wrong direction, which is really good.
Okay, and along those lines, another question about a population safety in breastfeeding mothers.
Same thing. So probably here in New Zealand, Fijoas are on our approved safety list for consumption during pregnancy due to our historic long consumption. Because our pop powder is just a freeze-dried fruit powder, there is nothing else in it. It is the whole fruit, just concentrated to increase those bioactives that we have effectively. It is incredibly safe for pregnancy. So even for things like supporting gestational diabetes is another really good, great one that we don't often see, I guess, a solution for. I mean, yeah, safe for breastfeeding because babies are also going to have it.
All right, excellent. Question, you mentioned the capsules, you mentioned yogurts. We have a question about, will the powder work in beverages? Is it soluble for that?
Yeah, so Felix has roughly a 76% solubility. That sort of other 20% is the fact that the Felix is actually made from the entire whole fruit, which includes the skins, which is really great because that means it helps with things like stability, and you don't actually need any of the excipients to prevent clumping, which is a problem we see in other fruit powders. But so it has a slight, but it is incredibly soluble as a result in a beverage. It can be used in such. We've seen it in shots as well as like a a lot more like a juice box thing. So yeah, definitely usable in beverages.
All right, excellent. And a question on USDA organic.
Something we're working on. It's is the short answer. We so all of our food is sourced from here in New Zealand, and the organic Fijo market currently is still quite a small market, but it's something that for next year, for our next year's season, which takes place in about May, we're expecting to be able to offer it as an organic product.
All right, excellent. So we'll stay tuned for that. And then, so before we wrap for the day, any final takeaways that either of you would like to leave us with?
I think, Philippa, you did a great job. Thank you so much for that wonderful information. Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate that some of those questions about safety and nursing and drug combinations, it is a whole fruit powder, so it does fall within kind of the general consumption guidelines for the U.S. It's self-GRAS for that reason. But as always, consult with a physician. Have to include that asterisk. So I just wanted to toss that in.
Absolutely, yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for joining us and for wrapping up the day with such an excellent session. Appreciate all that information. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.